It is considered a rabbinic holiday in that even though obviously it's part of the Bible, the story, and even though the 4 precepts, the 4 commandments, as it were, of the holiday are actually explicit verses in the book of Esther, if you remember back to when we very, very, very first discussed the concept of the commandments, a biblical command has to come through Moses. So even something that's in the overall, Testament, the Bible, so in this case the book of Esther, because it's obviously well subsequent to Moses, it is not a biblical command, but rather a rabbinic one on the biblical text of the book of Esther. So it is a holiday, for example, do work, using, you can drive, you can use your phone, those kinds of things, which otherwise, if it were a biblical holiday, very much like the Sabbath, the Shabbat, you cannot do all of those things. The basic concept of, the basic overview of the story is pretty straightforward, something that you're familiar with. Between the times of the destruction of the first temple and the rebuilding of the second temple, there were 70 years. There's a 70-year gap in between the two. And during this time, the overall area is ruled by the Persians. The king, I don't know how you say his name in English, but in Hebrew it's Achashverosh. So he rules 127 nations from India to Kush, which is Africa. The whole swath of the Persian Empire, including the land of Israel. That means that all of the Jewish people were the subjects of this empire. Despite the fact that after the first temple, or even before the destruction of the first temple, the Jewish people were strewn about, that's where we get the 10 lost tribes, nevertheless they were strewn in this area. So they never really, they went out of the land of Israel, but this is a massive swath of land. And so when all of this is happening, the Jewish people, wherever they might be found, not necessarily in Israel, in Shushan, which is Iran, is where a whole bunch of them at this point were, is still obviously under the rulership of this King Achashverosh. The king is not a good guy at all. But his wife is even worse. He becomes king because he marries her. She is the daughter of the previous king. So her kind of bona fides are greater than his. And there's an entire kind of dynamic in their relationship where he's never really quite good enough, and she's always kind of his boss and that kind of a scenario. Not that he's necessarily any better, but he finds an opportunity to get back at her. When he hosts a re-coronation party, he decides to throw an elaborate affair that doesn't last long, just 180 days. 6 months. 6 months of a party. And during the 6 months of a party, he hosts different delegations from different countries or kind of representative nations that he rules over. And one of the things that he gets into a kind of an argument or a match about is which nation's women are the prettiest. And so it's to show that the Persian Empire's women are the most beautiful. He commands that his wife come in very not modest dress, to say the least, and basically to make this kind of a beauty pageant for the hedonistic atmosphere that was at this celebration. She refuses, because after all, who are you to tell me I'm really the reason why you're king? And he executes her. So he executes her, and then he wants another. This entire time, the Jewish people are living, obviously, in this empire. When they are invited, when certain representatives, first of all, the way the party worked was there was like an elite echelon, and then their average, regular citizen can come. So the elite echelon were certain people from amongst the Jewish people who were somewhat special, standing in the government and whatever. They were invited specifically and individually. And then in general, it was open to the public. The Moses of that generation, the leader of the Jewish people, is named Mordechai. And he tells the Jewish people that they are not allowed to go to the party. The fact that it was promised and was in fact the case that all the food at the party was kosher, specifically to accommodate the Jewish people. So, in essence, Mordechai shows or emphasizes to the Jewish people that really it's not just food that's a question of kosherness. Yeah, the food can be kosher, but if everything over there is idolatry and hedonism and immorality, etc., what does it really matter? Like, you still can't go. Nevertheless, some of the Jewish people do go, and they, in essence, end up seeing the king wear the garments of the high priest. After there were these remaining garments of the high priest that the king himself dons, which is obviously an affront to God, to the temple, etc. And that's kind of where the episode of the party ends. The king wants to have a wife, and so based on his main advisor, Haman, who is a descendant of the Amalekites, not a friend of the Jewish people, he suggests that he make a beauty pageant. And in essence, any girl, woman in the entire kingdom that the guards and police basically who think is beautiful, she should be brought to the palace, whether she wants to or not. And the king can basically either not, reject her, accept her as a concubine, or marry her. That's the setup. And this also continues, if I'm not mistaken, for months. At the end of all of that, there is a particular woman, is Hadassah, and in time her name is changed to Esther, which means concealed one, because she concealed her Jewish identity, so that if, for whatever reason, the king didn't necessarily find favor with her, like he didn't find favor with his first wife, for example, that he not take it out on the rest of the Jewish people as well. She is taken to the palace against her will. She finds favor in the king's eyes, and he marries her. How she becomes queen. Mordechai, the leader of the Jewish people at this time, again, is both their leader, but he's also an advisor to the king as well. He, because he's Jewish, is not willing to prostrate himself, to bow down to Haman, who becomes the king's chief advisor, based on this whole scenario with the wife and the beauty pageant and everything. And Haman, being an Amalekite who also has a history with Mordechai, specifically from when the first temple was destroyed, he basically doesn't like Mordechai, doesn't like the Jewish people. So he makes a decree, he makes, in essence, a power play, which ends up in a decree from the king that the Jewish people are to be, in essence, hunted on a certain date by the rest of the populace. So the average Persian citizen can kill a Jew, or as many Jews as he wants, based on the calendar, and there will be no repercussions. The reason, kind of the official reason being that the Jewish people are a nation within a nation. They're not subservient to the Persian Empire. They don't want to assimilate. They want to be kind of their own thing, and that's not good for us as a society, as a country, something along those lines. The time, though, Haman doesn't know that Esther is Jewish. And so when Esther discovers and hears about this plot, she comes to the king and says, look, there's somebody who's trying to kill me. And the king says, what are you talking about? You're the queen. Who's going to try to kill you? Well, she says, I'm Jewish. And so, in essence, he's trying to kill not just me, but me included. And oh, by the way, it's that guy. And she points to Haman, who is there actually at a special meal that she makes for him and for Haman. At that point, the king realizes that Haman is trying to make a power play even for his own kingdom, in other words, to steal the crown. And he has him executed, and he proclaims that on the dates when ostensibly the Jewish people would be hunted down, they have a carte blanche to defend themselves. And in essence, a certain kind of a civil war, you can call it, happens. The Jewish people defend themselves, and Mordechai becomes the chief advisor to the king. everything that Haman was, Mordechai becomes. The queen, Esther, is proclaimed obviously queen and now can reveal her Jewish identity publicly. And in fact, their son, Dariovish, is Darius in English. Darius, who is the one that rebuilds the Second Temple, or funds rebuilding the Second Temple really, is their son. So in essence, it's a direct link to the redemption with the Second Temple. That's a very, very, very quick kind of overview of the story. The 4 things that we do in celebrating Purim is to have the reading of the actual book of Esther. If you remember, all 10 chapters, word for word. We also have a meal to celebrate the occurrence. If they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, has to be there. Then we, not necessarily during the meal, but during the daytime of the holiday, we make sure to include those that are less fortunate. And so there is the precept of giving gifts to the poor, that they should also be able to celebrate despite their usual inability to do so because of their financial restraints. And then also we give gifts to our fellows, so that there should be this kind of national unity around the celebration, not that everybody can celebrate does, but on their own, but rather that everybody's celebration is kind of intertwined with everybody else. Those are the 4 precepts of Purim. That said, there is an insight that is brought up where if we look at the progression of the story, and if we think of logistically what is most expedient, or what would have been most expedient to do for Mordechai and for Esther, the 2 main protagonists, given that they had the positions that they had and could have leveraged those positions, as soon as they would have found out about the plot to kill the Jewish people, they should have immediately somehow petitioned, lobbied or whatever, the king. It's his wife and one of his main advisors. And yet that's not what they do. That's eventually what they do, but that's certainly not initially what they do. Initially what they do is that Mordechai calls upon the entire Jewish people to repent and to add in Torah study and fulfillment of the commandments, specifically gathering tens of thousands of children, those whose kind of job, as it were, is basically to learn Torah all day. They don't have to worry about, having a job and making a living or any of those kinds of things that adults sometimes have to worry about. And that they should make sure to be studying Torah all day, every day. And the rest of the people should also improve their spiritual standing. Esther, who, being that she's a subject of the king, is not allowed to, by Persian law, to go into the king's private audience without having been called, lest he put the person to death. That's the rule. The verse in the book of Esther says that the law for the whole kind of country is that anybody who has not been called basically risks their life in trying to unilaterally go and speak to the king. If he doesn't want to talk to you, he has the right to kill you. And she hasn't been called for 30 days, and it's his wife. So imagine a husband who isn't speaking to his wife for 30 days. Something's, not right. And nevertheless, she is to go to the king to plead for, in essence, her people, but specifically to first and foremost see that he should see that she's Jewish, and this is a whole kind of a plot against her. And so before she does so, what you would think is that she should dress up extra nice, right? This isn't necessarily the kind of guy who's going to be appealed to by reason or by kindness and mercy. He's a hedonistic kind of a guy, so to look extra nice, to, somehow entice him in those ways. But what she does is that she fasts for 3 days straight. And she calls upon the rest of the Jewish people to fast as well. The reason why the fasting specifically has to take place is because of the sin that they went to the meal where Mordechai said that they shouldn't have gone. So the way that they ate at that meal, they should be fasting now. And the fasting achieves a level of atonement, a level of repentance or return. And only then does she go to the king. In both of these approaches, whether from the side of Mordechai or from the side of Esther, again, logistics and practicality would say, immediately go to the king, immediately leverage, try to kind of play up the physical side, but they don't. They eventually do so, right? She eventually goes to the king, and he eventually directs how this entire Mordecai directs how this entire thing should go, and eventually he takes the place of Haman. That's all eventually true. But first and foremost, they secure the spiritual side of the scenario. If these things are happening, they realize they are, of course, physical expressions, but of a spiritual truth. There's something wrong on the spiritual end, which is making all of this negativity happen on the physical end, on the practical end. And so, in order to fix it, in order to rectify the situation and to save ourselves, we have to first and foremost deal with the spiritual side, because that's the root cause anyway, and only then make that a vessel or a passageway for that spiritual improvement to also improve our physical, practical lot. And so that same lesson is something that we are to take for ourselves, not specifically and only in regards to the Purim, but in general. Whenever a person, physical or material difficulty, spiritual, and therefore, spiritually speaking, we have to fix the scenario, fix the situation, and then the physical will be fixed. And in general, to engender physical, material success and blessing, that's going to happen because of a spiritual achievement, which then is expressed in the physical. And so as to put the spiritual as primary and the physical as secondary, that's one of the main takeaways of the holiday, way of making a living. Right? He's not successful financially. He has an opportunity to take a job or get involved in some kind of a business that would be something that God disapproves of, but it's something that he could make money with. The practical side, if we eliminate God or spirituality from the discussion, so long as it's maybe not illegal and can get you in jail, what's wrong? But that's not how things actually work, because anything in the physical world, including a living, comes from God. And the only way that a person is going to have a sustained livelihood is because God gives him that blessing. So let's say like this. A person could become an abortion doctor, right? So as far as the secular legal system, he's not risky, he's not a drug dealer or something, right? So we're not talking about that. And he can make a living. He can make a good living. He's a doctor who provides that service, and that service is common, and whatever. But God, of course, disapproves of those kinds of things. And therefore, as much as from a logistical perspective, that could be a great livelihood, practically it won't be sustained as a livelihood, because not through the blessing of God. In order to therefore have a physical, practical, material livelihood, that is to be engendered through a blessing of God. So it might seem that he's going to kind of go the harder way. He has the opportunity to make $500,000 a year by being this, and he's going to forego that because God said no. That, on the practical level, doesn't seem right. But the reality is, of course, that the practical level is only an expression of the spiritual level, right? So only once he engenders the blessing from God on the spiritual level, by doing what's right, adding in acts of kindness and goodness, following God's law for whatever scenario we're talking about, whoever he is, that's how he's going to eventually, let's say, in this case, physical livelihood.